A ridge in the Zagros Mountains, 1975. A Kurdish fighter named Azad holds position with an American rifle. His brother, barely 18, carries an American-supplied radio. For 3 years, that radio has crackled with coordinates, warnings, and the implied voice of a superpower. On Tuesday morning, the radio goes dead. By Wednesday night, the Iraqi artillery begins. Nobody told Azad about the deal. Nobody told him Henry Kissinger had traded his war away in a conference room in Algiers. Nobody told him anything, because in the architecture of American covert action, he was never someone who needed to be told. He was a mechanism, and mechanisms don't get exit plans. When Congress demanded answers, Kissinger gave them 9 words. Covert action should not be confused with missionary work. This is the story of what those 9 words actually mean. The CIA had armed the Kurds. For 15 years, weapons and implied promises flowed into northern Iraq. Kurdish fighters held territory, buried friends, and believed a superpower stood behind them. Then Kissinger cut a deal, not with the Kurds, but through them, across them, without them, and overnight the pipeline closed. Iraqi forces moved, the killing began, and the man who oversaw the operation sat before a congressional committee and offered 9 words. That is the question this story asks, not whether covert operations require moral accounting. The institution already answered that. The question is, what kind of institution builds a doctrine designed to absolve itself of the consequences of its own promises? What kind of institution arms people, implies commitment, then abandons them overnight when the strategic arithmetic changes, and then codifies that abandonment as professional philosophy? The answer requires going back, not to 1975, not to the Algiers Agreement, not to the Shah, not to the moment the plug was pulled, to the beginning of the architecture itself, to the decision that was never really about the Kurds at all. February 1960. The CIA's Near East Division begins funding Kurdish guerrillas in northern Iraq, fighters pressing Baghdad for a measure of autonomy. The timing is not incidental. Iraqi leader Qasem has just helped create OPEC, challenging Western oil interests with exactly the kind of nationalist confidence Washington finds unacceptable. The Near East Division simultaneously requests methods to incapacitate him. The Kurds aren't the point. The Kurds are the instrument. The operation's true purpose was never Kurdish self-determination. It was a weakened Baghdad, a distracted Baghdad, a Baghdad too consumed by internal insurgency to challenge Western interests or threaten the Shah across the border. Iraq had to bleed. The Kurds would do the bleeding. The logistical architecture was built on a foundation the CIA had already constructed. In 1957, American intelligence helped establish SAVAK, the Shah's secret police, one of the most oppressive internal security forces in the world. Washington turned a blind eye because the Shah was useful. That relationship, that infrastructure, became the spine of everything that followed. Every rifle destined for Kurdish fighters crossed Iranian territory, not as a temporary arrangement, as the permanent, unexamined design of the entire operation. For 15 years, the arms kept moving. Kurdish fighters held territory. They buried their dead. They watched American weapons arrive and drew the only reasonable conclusion. A superpower doesn't arm you for 15 years without a reason. It doesn't send rifles and training and implied support across a decade and a half unless it intends to stand behind you. That was the logic, and it was not unreasonable logic. It was simply wrong. What the Kurds interpreted as a guarantee was, in the minds of the men running the operation, something considerably less binding. The arms were a mechanism. The Kurds were the mechanism's moving parts. Their beliefs about what the relationship meant were never factored into the architecture. because the architecture was never built around them. Then came 1972. Kissinger personally took the controls. Arms flows through Iran escalated. The operation grew in scale, in ambition, in the number of Kurdish fighters committed to a fight they believed they could eventually win. Kissinger made certain they couldn't. The calibration was deliberate and precise. Enough weapons to sustain the fighting, never enough to end it in Kurdish victory. The Shah needed Iraq weakened, not defeated. A victorious Kurdish independence movement would redraw borders, destabilize the region, and threaten the Shah's own restless Kurdish population inside Iran. Victory was never the objective. Hemorrhage was. Internal CIA reviews identified what should have been obvious. The entire operation ran through a single choke point: Iranian territory, Iranian cooperation, the Shah's continued willingness to serve as logistics host. No alternative supply route existed. No contingency had been built. Not one rifle moved through an alternative channel. Not one contingency was drafted. The assessments were written, filed, and ignored. The institution documented its own structural failure in real time and took no corrective action. The Shah needed Iraq weakened, not defeated. The CIA needed the Shah satisfied. The Kurds needed to keep fighting. All three conditions were being met, and as long as they were, no one with authority saw a reason to ask what happened if one of them stopped being true. And in March 1975, in a conference room in Algiers, one of them did. In March 1975, the Shah of Iran sat down with Saddam Hussein in Algiers and signed a border agreement resolving their territorial dispute along the Shatt al-Arab waterway. The negotiation was clean, the terms were mutual, and the deal was done before most of the world noticed it was happening. For two heads of state, it was diplomacy. For the Kurds, it was an execution order. The moment that agreement was signed, the Kurds' entire reason for existing in American strategy evaporated. They had no independent standing in United States policy, no bilateral relationship, no direct channel to Langley. Only derivative value, a function of the relationship between Washington, Tehran, and Baghdad. The Shah had used them to bleed Iraq without open warfare. Now he had what he wanted through a handshake instead. The mechanism was no longer needed. So the men inside the mechanism were left to die. Remember Azad, on that ridgeline, the dead radio, the artillery. Now you know what he didn't. The radio didn't malfunction. Nobody cut a wire. A Shah and a dictator shook hands over a waterway 1,000 miles from the Zagros Mountains, and Azad's war stopped being useful to anyone with the authority to sustain it. He didn't learn about Algiers until weeks later, after he had buried his brother in the frozen dirt with an American entrenching tool. After he had left the dead radio on the grave. After the Iraqi advance had pushed what remained of his unit off the ridgeline and into a refugee column, moving toward a border that might not let them cross. The CIA pulled the plug with no warning and no extraction plan. The arms pipeline through Iranian territory, the only pipeline that had ever existed, was severed overnight. Kurdish fighters who had held territory for years were left exposed on terrain they could no longer defend. Iraqi forces moved. Thousands were slaughtered or displaced. The scale of it was not incidental. It was the arithmetic consequence of pulling support from fighters mid-campaign with no corridor out and no contingency plan. So, what do you think? Does a superpower ever owe its proxies an exit plan, or was Kissinger right? Let us know in the comments. The operation had functioned exactly as its architects intended. The Kurds were never allies. They were a bleeding mechanism, calibrated so the wound never healed but never killed. But the deeper accounting was still coming, and it would arrive from a direction nobody in Langley had anticipated. The Kurds had been abandoned to preserve a relationship. That was the calculus. The Shah was the platform, the chokepoint, the entire architecture of American influence in the region. Sacrifice the proxies, keep the asset. Cold arithmetic, cleanly executed. 4 years later, the asset was gone. In January 1979, the Shah was toppled. The dynasty the CIA had protected, funded, and built its regional strategy around collapsed inside weeks. SAVAK, the secret police the agency had helped construct in 1957, was disbanded overnight. The infrastructure that had taken 2 decades to build evaporated in a revolution the CIA failed to predict with any meaningful lead time. When the Shah fell, the agency's listening posts in northern Iran, positioned near the Soviet border and irreplaceable for monitoring Soviet missile tests, were abandoned under emergency protocols, left wired to detonate if anyone tried to enter them. Years of infrastructure, gone. The Kurdish operation had been architected around a single asset. That asset had now delivered negative returns. The Kurds were sacrificed to preserve the United States-Shah relationship in March 1975. The United States-Shah relationship was extinct by January 1979. The institution had not merely betrayed its proxies, it had catastrophically misjudged its own primary investment. It lost the Kurds and Iran inside 4 years, both gone. The strategic calculus that justified abandoning thousands of fighters was itself wrong. No lessons were institutionalized, no doctrine changed. October 2019. Northeastern Syria. Kurdish SDF fighters, who had bled alongside American Special Operations Forces for years, who had lost 11,000 dead dismantling the Islamic State, watched American convoys pull back overnight. A deal had been struck with Turkey. The details were different. The architecture was identical. Single enabling partner, no redundancy, no off-ramp, no warning. Turkish artillery began falling within days. The 1975 precedent was not obscure. It was not buried in a classified annex that nobody read. It was documented, studied, and filed under lessons learned. The institution did not lack the knowledge, it lacked the will to build differently. Those are not the same failure. One is a gap, the other is a choice. The common thread across every iteration is not betrayal in the conventional sense. Betrayal implies a promise was made and broken. The uncomfortable truth is that no promise was ever made, not formally, not in writing. What was offered instead was the architecture of commitment, weapons, advisors, proximity, shared casualties, without the substance of it. The implied promise. The one that costs nothing to extend and everything to redeem. Kissinger's infamous 9 words were not a one-time deflection. They codified a doctrine. Proxy relationships carry zero moral obligation. That doctrine did not die with de-escalation. It governed the Kurdish operation in 1975. It governed Syria in 2019. Covert action should not be confused with missionary work. Say it enough times, and it stops sounding like an excuse. It starts sounding like policy. Because it is. The off-ramp was never built. Not in 1975. Not in 2019. And somewhere right now, in a mountain range or a desert corridor, fighters who have bled alongside American Special Operations Forces are counting on a promise that was never actually made.